Is this an assignment?
Well, it's going to be. I want to know more background about unions as I.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can share what I know about most
Yeah,
of what I know
yeah.
is NEA. Okay.
Yeah. And actually, my interest is, what your perceptions of the union, what the NEA was before,
Right.
when you were working with NEA, and what your perception of the NEA is today.
Oh, okay.
And which direction it's headed.
Sure.
But first of all, I want to start off with, what's the relationship? What's the historical relationship between the NEA and the AFT? It used to be fairly competitive, but it seems to me that in the late '90s, it's really become much more cooperative.
Okay. Well, initially, my understanding is that the AFT was started because they didn't think that NEA was union enough, that it was too much of a professional organization. And I think as you read that book I gave you, you're going to find that most of the leaders were higher ed or administrators, and the focus was on professional development, professional issues, etc. And so then after the AFT was formed in the late 1970s, the NEA, I gather, felt that a lot of the members were moving over to AFT because they were more union.
Okay, so they were losing membership.
Right, and so NEA began to focus more on collective bargaining and on political action, and that happened all the way through like the '60s and the '70s. And as we moved into the '80s, one of the concerns the members began to express is that we have lost our professional focus, and so we're focusing really heavily on the.
Well, it seems to me, with what I've read, that the NEA has always been concerned with the professional focus, and sometimes to its detriment, in the sense that it hasn't joined up with the AFT in unionizing, but also as a balancing voice.
Right. Well, I think they saw themselves as going in two separate directions. If you look at the South is very professional, quote unquote, or association. You look at the North, it's more of a union. And my argument was we're both. We are here for bread and butter issues, which would be union and political action, but we're also here for professional issues. Right. And so part of what Willie McGuire and I and Keith Geiger and a lot of people, we tried to bring the two areas together.
Okay.
When Shanker was in office, we started working together on the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And then we began to work together on other issues. So a lot of the divisiveness began to be moved aside. And then they started talking about the possibility of forming one union because there were so many attacks on public education and the unions were being blamed. So we tried to do a vote. I'm trying to remember in the mid 1990s when Bob Chase was the president. They wanted to do a vote, and the members voted it down, and they said no.
Was it a narrow vote?
I don't think it was that. It was closer than we thought, but the big issues were NEA has a very strong policy on diversity and making sure that we have equality as it relates to minorities being involved in the organization. Another big issue was a secret ballot. And the NEA believes that members have a right on some issues like the voting for officers, the Constitution and bylaws, budget, certain issues they have a right to a secret ballot. And then there was a third issue, and I can't remember.
A secret ballot as like an anonymous ballot? Or?
Right.
Okay.
Right, so nobody knows how you voted, that's your right. And the AFT, the third one was NEA is separate from the AFL-CIO. And
the AFT is?
NEA is.
Oh, NEA is, okay.
And so NEA is separate from the AFL-CIO, even though it was agreeing to work with the AFL-CIO as long as it could maintain those first two things. The vote failed, but what they did is they came up with an agreement that we would work together on certain issues like the national board and budget issues and things like that. They also came up with an agreement that we wouldn't raid each other.
Okay.
And but I noticed when I was at the RA this summer, the people in Alabama and a couple of places were saying that AFT was coming in.
So there are some flare-ups here.
Right, there are some flare-ups. Okay. Now, you have 11, I believe there are 11 states that have merged, like Montana, Florida, etc. So New York,
okay. All right, on the state level.
You have what you have. So it seems as though the merger is going to come from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And I know Florida, Montana, what was another one? New York, and a lot of large urban school districts like San Francisco has merged, LA has merged, and so you have a lot of them where they have already merged together,
Okay.
and they're working on
You
issues.
know, I'm glad you clarified that because when I read research on unions, sometimes they would use AFT NEA
Right.
together, and I wasn't sure how that worked out.
Right.
But so even on on the local level, they could also choose to merge.
Right.
Okay.
And see, when they do that, they pay dues to the NEA, they pay dues to the AFT, and they also belong to the AFL-CIO.
So do the membership dues increase because of
No.
that? Okay.
But well, I shouldn't say no. For example, if you were in New York, your dues did increase because you got to pay NEA, you have to pay AFT, and you have to pay AFL-CIO. Where before maybe all you paid was AFT or NEA, and so in the circumstances, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned Albert Shanker and Bob Chase because they seem to get the credit for the idea of professional unionism or new unionism. But I did read one of your articles. I mentioned it in class to Phi Delta Kappan in 1989, where you talked about you seem to criticize the idea of very similar to Ravitch that businesses have hijacked the mission of education and that there really needs to be more of a professionalism. So do you think the idea of professional unionism and the collaborative unionism and the idea of joint leadership with districts, was that something that had been brewing in the NEA's leadership for quite some time before Bob Chase came out with it publicly?
Yeah. It had really started like with Willard McGuire, and then I inherited it because when Willard stepped out, as Willard was leaving, that's when A Nation at Risk came out. And then when I came in, see, one of the things we said is we can't oppose this, we have to support it. And by the way, Bob opposed the National Board. And, and you've got Bob and the guy who's the current executive director of NEA, but they now support it. And Keith Geiger and I were the ones who led the fight for the national board, and Al Shanker and his group already supported, but we got the members to vote 80% for it. And but it started back in the late 70s and the 80s and moved into the 90s. And our point was, how can we say we're for quality education if we're not putting forth ideas, if we're not supporting ideas that we believe would improve the quality of education? So each generation of leadership has built upon what others have had in place.
And then it kind of culminated in the in the term new unionism or professional unionism. Now,
and see, as I said, when I would go out and speak, and when Keith was speaking, and Willard would do the same thing. Our point was you can't divide us in half. You know, I'm a professional and I'm also a union member because I believe that I should be able to earn a decent salary. I should have certain benefits, certain
the bread and butter issues.
But I should also be fighting for the professional issues and the children.
Well, and it seems to me that there's teachers are kind of an in-between sort of profession where the bread and butter issues are so important, but teachers see themselves as professionals, and I guess the unions really have to balance that.
And one of the things that I'm seeing is as new members come in, and I began to see this in the 80s and the 90s, one of the things that they were saying is, what are you doing for me to help me be a better teacher? I know you're helping me improve my pay and my benefit, but how are you helping me be a better professional? And if you go back and look at the NEA now, for example, there was one point where they were proposing to get rid of the Instruction and Professional Development Division, and I fought to keep that. Now,
within the NEA,
because they wanted it to be strictly union.
Okay.
Now, if you go back, one of the largest components in the NEA is what they call the Teacher Quality Professional Development Unit.
You had mentioned that before.
Right. And they also have the Research Division, which I visited, must have been Tuesday, and I was very impressed with how much they've grown that. So they really are placing a lot more emphasis on research, a lot more emphasis on instruction and professional development, working more closely with the AACTE, the National Board, working more closely with NCAID and things like that. So they're doing a lot more work in the area of professional development.
Now through the history of unionism and even your perception of the NEA and also the AFT today, it seems to me that even within the unions, policy seems to be a hot topic, which direction the union is going in. I know that in our class we talk about various stakeholders and key players. Is there a significant chunk of either unions that believe that either the NEA or the AFT should solely be an industrial union?
Yeah, if you look at states like, if you look at Michigan, if you look at like Illinois, Indiana, a lot of the northern states,
The Rust Belt.
they would place more emphasis on the quote unquote union piece. If you look at the southern states and the states in the middle of Midwest, southern states would be more professional. The ones in the Midwest, etc., would be said like a balance.
Okay.
New York would be probably pretty union. Rhode Island would be union. Connecticut would be a balance.
Okay.
Massachusetts would be a balance. So it depends on the state. And what a lot of people don't realize is all of the states don't have collective bargaining rights. Mm-hmm. So the states that have strong collective bargaining rights through the government, they would be more union folk. Mm-hmm. The ones that don't would be more professional folk. Even though now, even they are moving more toward professional issues. Mm-hmm. For example, I was really surprised when they said that 75 to 80% of the race to the top proposals are advocating national board. Mm-hmm. And I can remember when the union didn't support national board.
Okay.
And so now that's what they're advocating.
Now, as one of the components that helped kind of kick this alternate mm-hmm. idea that unions were not just bread and butter,
right.
like back in the 80s, like the article that you had written. Right. How did you go about selling that to idea that unions could also address professional issues?
Basically, by looking at, I'm from a state where we don't have collective bargaining, mm-hmm. but we obviously believe that teachers ought to have a professional salary. We believe they ought to have certain protections, etc. And my point to them is even harder for us to fight for those things than it is for you because we don't have any kind of legal foundation. Right. We just have to fight.
Meet and confer,
but at the same time, we have to be very concerned about the professional area because, in my opinion, Steve, if we fail professionally, then the union fails. Mm-hmm. And if you don't succeed,
so the reputation of the entire organization hinges on that.
Right. Right.
How was that received?
Not just the reputation of the reputation of the school system, the quality of education. All of that is contingent upon our members and what our members are doing. And people are not just going to say the school, it's the teachers and the union. Mm-hmm. And if you look at a lot of what's going on now, it's the teachers and the unions. Mm-hmm. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that the profession we support is doing the job it's supposed to be doing. Okay. Because if not, then that hurts us. Mm-hmm.
How was that received? I would assume that when these ideas were coming
initially,
up,
there were people who were highly critical of me, and she doesn't understand the union. She's not supporting unions. And I said, I am supporting unions and unionism mm-hmm. because by advocating for quality, I'm saying that my profession and my union, that the work we do is of the highest quality.
Okay.
And if I don't say that, that basically is saying that we can just do whatever we want to do. We don't have any parameters. We don't have any benchmarks or anything. And people began to listen.
Okay.
They began to say, well, and the younger teachers in particular, what are you doing to help me be a better teacher? What are you doing to help me solve these problems? I'm not just interested in the bread. It was the younger teachers who were really asking for all this mm-hmm. help.
And that's actually something that's reflected in a lot of Albert Schenker's writing, too, mm-hmm. because he talks about the older generation being more interested in just surviving, right. and now that people's needs are generally much right. better met, professionals are beginning right. to ask about things of higher level right. needs.
And so a lot of it depends on what's the background of the people with whom you're dealing. If their background is strictly, quote unquote, the traditional union, mm-hmm. then they are not going to support. But if their background is like a combination, they understand that there's a closely integrated relationship between unionism and professionalism.
Now, as the national level and the state level unions monitor local union mm-hmm. activity, if they notice, say, that in Western Pennsylvania, some of the local unions are very their priority issues are more of the salaries and mm-hmm. benefits. Do they come in and provide encouragements to also address professional issues as well?
Well, only if they're invited. The way it works with NEA, mm-hmm. the states and the locals are basically independent.
Okay.
And as long as they're not violating the NEA Constitution and bylaws, mm-hmm. they can do it. For example, Denver has decided to go with merit pay, performance-based pay.
That seems very controversial, even
right.
within the union.
Right, but mm-hmm. but they have the right to do that as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution.
Okay.
And NEA is working with them to make sure that it's not imposed on them, but it's something they're working together to develop. This whole concept around peer review, if you had raised this issue 25, 30 years ago, you would have been chased out of the room.
Right.
Now, NEA is working with this through the teacher quality, professional development. What do we mean by peer review? How do we train the teachers? What are their roles and responsibilities?
Well, it seems to me, like you said, that a lot of the change, even the idea of merging, seems to be a grassroots movement, and it probably is the best way to do that.
And a lot of it has to do with what's happening. It's a transformation that's happening at the district level, and you don't want to lose your members.
Right.
So how do you satisfy your members? How do you work with your members?
So let them start.
Right. You let them come to you, and they're not unless the RA passes a resolution or a policy that absolutely forbids and says if you do this you're going to be kicked out, then they can work outside of that.
Okay, so there's flexibility beyond the Constitution.
Right.
So would it be a fair characterization to say that the peer review, the successes of the peer review system in Ohio that has spread throughout the state really helped change both unions' perception of peer review?
And the guy who did that, John Grossman, was one of the strongest members of NEA's leadership.
Okay.
And one of the strongest union leaders you could have. But John Grossman was the one who put that in place. And if you look at what John was doing, initially people were critical, but now you have more and more union districts looking at what did he do and how can we do it? You know, and like Montgomery County. Montgomery County is putting in a peer review process.
Yeah,
I mean,
I have read their contract.
Right.
And it by the way, it's so interesting that in Chesapeake, it's just a one-page contract, and it's 320 pages in Montgomery County.
Right.
But it's very comprehensive, and you're right. They do spell out, and I'm sure the union had something to do with it, specifically that it couldn't just be peer review; it had to be peer assistance and then review.
Right.
Yeah.
And what kind of feedback are you giving to the teachers? How do you train these people? What role do they play as to whether or not the teachers keep their job? And again, it's sitting down and working out the details. See, then that's basically.
And so if the local unions invite the state level in, they'll be glad
they have to
come
inform
in.
the state.
Okay.
And the state usually will try to work with them, and then they have to inform the NEA.
Okay.
And the NEA, and what they do is they sit down. Does this violate the policy, or is there enough flexibility in the policy that they can do this? And
so is the working procedure for the NEA very similar to the AFT? Would you know that?
Well, the AFT model, I think they have probably more flexibility because what I used to notice was you read their policies and it would say one thing, but when you heard them talk, it was totally different.
Okay.
And what we had to do is we had to stick to the policy.
Okay.
So they said, NEA members would say, well, wait a minute, that's not what the policy said. So you have to stick to the policy.
So there was more of an official line.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I don't want to take your time, but I kind of want to move into one last segment.
Sure.
What's your take on the state of the unions today? Because and this is just my impression. I get the impression that unions have such a bad rap that even if they were to open their mouths on a productive issue like professionalism, that they would almost be dismissed. And if that perception is true, what do you think went wrong there? Because I just look at our last.
One of the things I used to say to the members is you can't say no. If you say no, what do you propose?
Okay.
And you just can't say no. And part of what happened was, when policies would come out from the government, from agencies, from business, from think tank, you say no. No, you just can't do that. What are you proposing? And if you go back and look at A Nation at Risk, they only had one teacher on that panel.
Okay.
If you go back and look at the goal, they didn't invite any educators. And it's not just the unions, it's K-20. They don't invite the higher ed folks either.
Okay.
And what we've done is we painted this picture of we are opposed to change. And so one of the things that I'm seeing now is more of an outreach. How do we sit down and work with, how do we form
so this is what the union is doing
right,
now.
forming alliances, forming networks of where we can work together. And where we might not agree on everything, there's enough agreement where we can at least come up with some common goals, some common...
Which is very reflective of professional unionism.
Right, and so that's basically what they're trying to do.
Do you think that's working, or is it too early to tell?
It's working, but it's still... there's still a lot of question marks.
Okay.
This is what is working. And so what the teachers organizations do, they're reaching out to different groups. They may not be working with some of the primary groups, that they're forming their own coalitions, their own bodies of work. And it's going to take time to convince people that yes, we are for change, yes, we are for quality, etc.
Who would you say is the greatest opponent to teacher unionism today? I know that there are a lot of people on the streets who, without really truly understanding what unions are about, will say that they're against it.
Quite a few of the policymakers
Okay.
are. So a lot of people from the business community are. And that's because the teachers' union.
So you agree with Ravitch in that?
Yeah.
In that
There are a lot of
statement?
areas where I agree with her on what she's saying. But my concern is, how do we build alliances to transform the education system, not just save it, but to transform it? Because my concern is, well, let me be just very honest with you. If the public education system fails, the unions are going to fail. That's their foundation.
Right.
And it doesn't matter whether it's NEA, AFT, the Catholics, the professional organizations. They're like 4 or 5 different organizations. Most people focus on the NEA and AFT, but you got the Catholics, and you got what is called the National Association of Professional Educators.
Oh.
Okay, so
Did not know.
all of us are contingent on the school system. And my point is, you ought to make sure that your foundation, the groups that you represent are the highest quality, so that this is your pride. This is my product. That I'm producing the highest level of education we've ever had. And so when I go back and look at that foundation, we need to make sure that we're advocating and we are being successful in improving the quality of education.
So in your support of the National Board in the past, would you agree with Albert Shanker's, because he tries in many instances to make the connection that teacher unions need to move in some ways towards the AMA for medicine or the bar and for law? Is that a direction that you agree with?
What you have to understand is the idea of the National Board came out of Scotland and Ireland. It's not something that was original here.
Okay.
And one of the things, I was in a meeting the other day, and I just learned that now they're forming a global national board, national teachers board, and I didn't know they were doing that. So there must be like about 15 or 20 different countries that are forming, that have national boards now. In those national boards, the teachers control who comes in and who stays. Now you got to understand, when you look at the AMA, you look at the Bar Association, you look at all these professional groups, it's not just a matter of defining what do you need to know to get in. You have the practice side as well. And so Mary Futrell meets the requirements to come in. Over the years, does Mary Futrell continue to meet the professional requirements to stay in?
Right.
And they can tell me I have to leave.
So it's almost like a larger version of pure assistance and review, not just on the local level. I mean, essentially, would you agree that the PAR programs are local boards?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And personally, I think it's a great idea, because who knows better what should be going on than the people who are actually on the front line. And you've got exemplary teachers. And I was talking to a guy in Montgomery County, and he's been asked to be one of the peer reviewers, and the guy's great. And he can sit down and work with those teachers. He understands what they're doing, going through every single day. I think it's a good idea. But
it seems to be common sense and yet ignored that teachers have a lot to say about the education system, and a lot of times they're left out on the local, state, and federal level.
I think it's one of the most overlooked assets that we have. The expertise, the knowledge, the professionalism that they bring, and yet we're not at the table.
We've hit a lot of these questions, so I'm glad that I didn't stick with it. You hit a lot of these. And just to give you, we're going to wrap up here. Just to let you know, that's kind of where my interest is. I do want to study the differences between unions that prioritize more industrial items in collective bargaining versus unions that prioritize professional issues. And of course they're going to advocate both types of items, but where their priorities lay. So that's really the foundation of where my
And I think the book that I've given you will help, because basically it focuses on the first 100 years that NEA was organized and how it focused on the teaching profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the document I gave you, the short document I gave you, moves it from 1857 to 1957 to 2002. And so hopefully that will help.
Great.
Okay?
Thank you very much. I
welcome.
appreciate that.
And
Thank
if there's
you.
anything I can do when